So this is day 2 on completing the square, and so you've got these two same sets of directions, just more problems to practice. So first set asks us to complete the square to form a perfect square trinomial, then we're going to factor. And so again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this b term here, and we're going to take half of this number. Now let's just go over why we take half of it again. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say it was x plus 3, and we were writing this is a quantity being squared. And so if I was to multiply this out, and I use that FOIL method, the first, outer, inner, and last, we end up with this. First of all, I wrote it out twice so you can see them. I multiply the first terms, so my first terms are x times by x, and that makes an x squared. Now my outside terms are x times by the 3, and so that makes a 3x. Inside terms are exactly the same. 3 and x multiply to make a 3x. Well, the last terms are 3 and 3, and those multiply to make 9. And so here we've got 3x and 3x, and that adds to make 6x. And so we get our answer there, 6x and 9. We've got the x squared as well. So we've got two perfect squares, and notice that the 3x and the 3x, the inside and outside terms will always be the same. So what we could end up doing is taking half of this term. See, if I took half of 6, I would end up with 3, and those would be the two last numbers in our two binomials, the 3 and the 3, and they'd multiply to make 9. And so that's what we're going to end up trying to do. So we're going to take this b term here, and we're always going to take half of this number here. And so once we take half, we end up with 9, and then we're going to take that 9, and we're going to square it. And the reason, again, is this. See, I know that the factored form is going to end up being x plus 9. And another x plus 9, because those numbers have to be exactly the same. You see, x and 9 make 9x, 9 and x make 9x, and those add to make that 18x, which is what I have as the middle term. And so they had to be the same numbers, so all we have to do now is just square that 9, and we figure out what it is we have to add to make it a perfect square trinomial, 81. And see, 9 and 9 make 81, so that's the factored form. So we do the same thing with 16. Negative 16 times by 1/2 ends up giving us a negative 8. And so negative 8, that's the number that's going to go inside the two binomials, x minus 8 and x minus 8. And from there you can see negative 8 and negative 8 ends up making 64. And so again, you're just going to take that negative 8 and you're going to square that number, and that's how we end up getting that 64. So when it's an odd number, you're just going to leave it as a fraction. See, 5 times 1/2 makes 5 halves. And so we know that the factored form is going to be x plus 5 halves. And another x plus 5 halves. And so from that point, we know that 5 halves times 5 halves ends up making a 25 fourths. So you just square both of those numbers. And that's how we come up with those answers. So we're going to use that concept again when we are completing the square. First step always in completing the square is to move that constant to the other side. Again, you want to complete the square with just the x terms that you have. So you've got your x squared term, your minus 2x, and then leave a little bit of a gap because you're going to add a number to make that a perfect square trinomial. And so how do you make it a perfect square? Well, same thing we were just doing there. Take that negative 2, that b term, and take half of it. Find out the two numbers that multiply to make, or add to make, negative 2, which would be negative 1 and negative 1. So I know the way this ends up factoring is x minus 1 quantity squared. So before you even figure out what goes in place of this last term, you already know the factored form. It's got to go x minus 1 quantity squared. So you just square this number, take that negative 1 and square it, and that'll tell you what to add to both sides. Now it's real important to make sure you add that 1 to this other side. A lot of people will forget that step. And so we end up with a x minus 1 quantity squared equals 25. So from that point, you're taking the square root of both sides, and that'll leave you with this x minus 1. And from there, this all equals plus or minus 5. Remember, two answers you get when you take 25. You can either have negative 5 and negative 5, or a positive 5 and positive 5. So from this point, you're just going to add the 1 to all sides, and we end up with our two possible answers. 5 plus 1 is 6, and negative 5 plus 1 makes negative 4. So there it is, negative 4 and 6, the two x-intercepts. Well, in this problem, it's already set equal, so all we're going to do is take that negative 6 and take half that number, and that makes negative 3. And so you already know what the factored form is. It's x minus 3 quantity squared. Well, square that negative 3, and that tells you what to add to both sides. So we already had factored this x squared minus 6x plus 9, factored over here. But you also have to add that 9 to this other side. Now make sure you watch the sign there. Negative 5 and 9 make a positive 4. And so from that point, you're just going to take the square root of both sides. So when you take that square root, it cancels out that squared symbol, just leaving us with this x minus 3. This all equals plus or minus 2. Remember, 2 times 2 makes 4, but negative 2 times negative 2 also makes 4. So that's why we have to have both. So we want to find the values of x that make it either negative 2 and negative 2 or positive 2 and positive 2. So let's see how to do that. You just add 3 to both sides, and that'll give you the values of x that make that the case. See, you can go ahead and add that 2 plus 3 makes the 5, but you also have a negative 2 plus 3 makes positive 1. So 1 comma 5 are the two x-intercepts. Well, this next one, again, you're moving that 16 over to the other side first. So once we've done that, we're ready to complete the square. So now we've got x squared plus 10x, and this all equals a negative 16. And so from that point, we're going to figure out what half this term is. Half the 10 is 5. And so when we've got 5, you know what the factored form is. It's going to be an x plus 5 quantity squared. Well, you square that 5, and it tells you what to add to both sides. And that's 25. So we're adding 25 to both sides. Put the plus 25 on this side as well. And so from there, we go ahead and do this work. Remember, negative 16 plus 25, you got to subtract those two numbers. So that's why our answer here, I'm going to go ahead and do that subtraction, is positive 9. So from that point, you're just taking the square root of both sides. And when you do that, we're left with an x plus 5 equals plus or minus 3. And so from that point, all you're going to do is move this 5 to the other side. So we'll subtract that 5 from all sides. So we'll go ahead and put that minus 5 right there. And we have a 3 minus 5, which makes negative 2. That's one of the answers. But we also have a negative 3 minus 5, which ends up giving us a negative 8. And those are our two solutions, negative 2 and negative 8. So I'll put those in the brace to represent our solution set. Well, one more problem. This one's a little bit different because we have this 3x squared. We haven't seen one of these yet. And so what you're going to want to do first is you're going to want to take out that common factor. And the common factor is 3. And that's one of the rules, is always get rid of that number out in front of x squared, just so it's just an x squared. You don't want any number out in front. So that's always the first step. Get rid of that by dividing by 3. So we're just going to leave the 3 out for now. And so we divided it by both sides. And so we just factored that 3 out. And so here's what we're left with. We're left with an x squared minus 12x. And oops, forgot to divide that 12 by 3. So let's just fix that real quick. So divide that 3 into 12 goes 4 times, so 4x. And divide the 3 into 36 goes a negative 12 times. And this all equals 0 still. And so from that point, you're going to move that 12 back to the other side. So we'll go ahead and add it to all sides. And then from there, we can go ahead and we're ready to complete the square. So I've got x squared minus 4x. Leave a little gap for that positive 12. And that leave a little gap for the number that we're going to end up having to add to make that a perfect square trinomial. And so what we'll do is take that negative 4, and you're going to take half of this number. And so when we take half of negative 4, we end up with a negative 2. So when we take that negative 2, we know what the factored form is. It's an x minus 2 quantity squared. So you're going to take that negative 2, and you're going to square it, and that'll tell you what to add to both sides. It's a positive 4. So that's what I'll add to both sides there. And so what I've got is when I add the 12 and the 4, I end up with 16. So that's where this number comes from. And then from there, I'm ready to take my square root of both sides. So I'll go ahead and take the square root of this side, take the square root of this other side. And so here's what we're left with now. We now have an x minus 2, but this now equals a plus or minus 4. And so from that point, all I have to do is add this 2 to both sides, and we'll have our answers. So when I add the 2, I've got two different problems to set up. 4 plus 2 makes 6, and negative 4 plus 2 makes negative 2. And so those are our two answers, negative 2 and 6. So those are the problems you're going to end up seeing on tonight's homework. So good luck.